There is some concern over a new provincial police force for our province. Justice Minister Casey Medu is all for it, but others are concerned this new force will cost Albertans lots of money more, hundreds of millions of dollars more than the RCMP. To discuss this in more detail is Lethbridge East MLA Nathan Neudorf joining us from Edmonton. Nathan, Premier Kenney is pushing for this, but where will the extra funding really come from?
Well, that's a really good question, Hal. What we need to realize is that the federal government has recently approved some significant pay increases for the RCMP. So in years coming forward, that cost on the province is actually going to go up significantly. According to the data that I've seen from the report, is if we were to switch to an Alberta police force, it would actually cost less in the long run because of that increased cost. And what we really want to see is more local decision making. Right now, so many of our RCMP officers, their support is from Ottawa, and they're just not getting the support and decision making that's effective, efficient, and timely for the people here in Alberta. And that's what's really driving this conversation.
So why not just keep the RCMP though, Nathan? I know many RCMP members, they're well entrenched in their communities for 20, 30 years. You know, they're already well established. Why not just keep them already in place here across the province?
Well, that's what we would really ideally love to do. Is we would love to retain those frontline RCMP officers, those men and women who serve their communities really, really well. It's the Ottawa bureaucracy and that detached decision making that's really causing provinces troubles. And Alberta's not alone in this. Nova Scotia is looking at moving away from the RCMP. Saskatchewan is now looking at that as well. There's a cost benefit decision to be had here, but it's also about the best service for the people right here in Alberta. And we've seen that on a lot of fronts, Hal, that decisions made in Ottawa aren't necessarily the best decisions for the people living here in Alberta. And that's what we really want to talk about.
Okay, let's switch gears for just a moment here, Nathan. A recent report says opioid deaths have gone up quite a bit here in our province in Alberta. In fact, we're on track for our deadliest year for overdose deaths ever. Since May of 2020, overdose deaths have jumped 45%. Now more than 100 people have died each month from overdose deaths here. And a lot of them are people in their mid to late 30s are most at risk, making up 3/4 of those overdose fatalities. Now, we still have an opioid crisis here in our city. What solutions are you proposing maybe that can be brought up to really help those who want and need the help?
Yeah, Hal, it's been very difficult. I think that the pandemic has definitely had a very negative impact on some of the people caught in addiction. And I think that means that we have to readjust our focus, that we're not treating a drug problem, we're treating an addictions problem. And that's why we're adding pillars to the strategy to help individuals who are caught in addiction. There's still the supervised consumption site that's still there, but now we're adding treatment and recovery and long-term treatment and recovery beds. We've spent over $15 million in Southern Alberta, in Lethbridge, Standoff, and Fort Macleod to add beds to that capacity to help people recover from these addictions. Now, it's going to take some time to build the facilities, but the spending is there, the commitment is there, the services are coming. Unfortunately, with the pandemic, they just couldn't be brought online quickly enough for some individuals, but we're still working in a very positive direction to get them the support that they truly need.
Now, we also have a serious doctor shortage here in Lethbridge. In fact, my wife and I lost our doctor. We even left the country altogether. What's being done to attract more physicians here to our region?
Yeah, this has been the top issue on my desk for about 8 months now. And I've had many, many conversations. It's a very challenging topic. Obviously, there's nuance to it that most people don't understand. We have the Ministry of Health that oversees this area, but there's Alberta Health Services, which governs the healthcare within hospital facilities. Family doctors don't operate typically in hospital facilities. They're outside of that in an independent practice. And that is the third entity, Alberta Health, who governs those contracts and the hiring of those doctors. Now, the government doesn't have the ability to force people to practice anywhere. They don't, just as they can't force people to set up businesses anywhere. So how do we attract that? Well, one is we have to get back to the table for the AMA master agreement and resolve those issues. Many doctors want to see efficiency and cost savings in the area of health. We have to work with them, get that agreement. So we take that uncertainty out of the market. That's a very significant starting point. Then from there, I'm really working on trying to have more rural training. In fact, I was asking questions about that yesterday in the legislature. It's a known and a study that students who train in more rural settings tend to set up a practice in more rural settings. Because you can imagine after 7 to 10 years of training, if you're well established wherever you're at, in a city or in a town, you're more likely to stay there, whether you develop relationships, whether you purchased a home, established a business, that kind of thing. So that's some of the efforts we're looking for, but obviously that's a little more long term.
The province says 80% of eligible Albertans are now fully vaccinated. In fact, recent stats say more than 3.2 million Albertans are now fully vaccinated against COVID-19. Nathan, there's still a number of Albertans, including right here in Lethbridge, who refuse to get the vaccine and want their wishes respected. We keep hearing, it's my body, my choice. So what do you want to say to those Albertans who are watching right now who do not want to be vaccinated?
Well, I would ask them to make sure they're comfortable before they get vaccinated, but to truly consider it. But to also let them know that I am fighting for their freedoms and liberties. The Alberta Bill of Rights and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms clearly protects those rights. And I want to make sure that they have the freedom to make that decision in their own time and in their own way. So that means that we really have to be focusing on capacity. We need to be focusing on correcting our healthcare system so that we have the freedom to do that and not put pressure on them in a way that makes them feel uncomfortable. Some people just need that time. And we know that some people just never will become vaccinated. But that is one of the beauties of living in Alberta and in Canada, that we have those rights and freedoms protected.
Nathan, the official opposition has been on the attack of Bill 79, the Trails Act. NDP environment critic Marlon Schmidt says the bill would give Environment and Parks Minister Jason Nixon more power over Alberta's trails. And they call into question Nixon's track record over managing public lands in light of the controversy of coal mining in the eastern slopes of the Canadian Rockies. And he also imposed that fee on nature with Kananaskis Conservation Pass. Now, your thoughts on that?
Well, again, the opposition is doing what the opposition does, is oppose legislation. But I think the K-Pass actually was extremely successful. We raised over $10 million in park fees this year on that, even with that very moderate fee, a $10 a day or $90 for the year. And that tells you just how heavily used it is. So you can imagine trails in our nature areas, if they're seeing 5 million footprints go by them every year, that's a lot of work to manage. So we're going to pour that money right back into it to manage those trails, to protect those trails, to work with our First Nations people to protect their way of life and some of their areas that we want to be protected. And that takes time and it takes money. Well, this is closing the loop on that. The first part was the fee on parks, but it's being poured back into those trail systems to manage them, to protect them, so they're there for you and they're there for your children and they're for your grandchildren. And I think that's just responsible stewardship and management where we see a lot of use, and that's just something that we had to do. And I believe this is the next responsible step.
Nathan, you've got your hand on the pulse of what's happening in the legislature right now. When it comes to coal mining and exploration, especially with companies, let's say Australia, New Zealand coming here and doing their coal mining in the eastern slopes, a lot of people are concerned about the selenium making its way into our water supply for the Oldman River. So what are you hearing right now? Are a lot of those contracts going to be null and void? Or are we going to maybe not consider more contracts in the future to protect our wildlife and water supply?
Well, that's the question for the governing boards and bodies, including the federal Ministry of Climate Change, and I forget the exact term of it, those applications have been denied in my mind. So everything is on hold. That environmental process remains in place to do exactly that, is to understand and manage any applications that come forward. And as far as I am aware, that the latest ones have not been approved. And my position has always been that we do need to develop our resources, but it has to be safely and carefully. And yeah, protecting our water as a precious resource, not just for human consumption, but for our irrigation, our farmers and ranchers, that's a pretty significant industry. And we can't harm one on behalf of another. So the process is there and the protections that are there, I believe they're doing the job that they were meant to do.
Now, one of the questions on the recent municipal election ballot was if we should have a third bridge here in our city. The majority of those in our city voted yes. I know a lot of people live on the west side. Now, I've chatted with newly elected Mayor Blaine Hagan, who said it would be extremely costly. Even though local taxpayers would be on the hook for the potential project, would the province maybe help us out a bit financially?
Well, and that's a great question, Hal. It really depends on where that third bridge goes. If it goes within the city limits, then the structure for funding to the city already exists with the MSI program, the Municipal Sustainability Initiative, which it has seen some recent reductions over the next few years. The other option is if that bridge goes outside the city limits, then it becomes the jurisdiction and payment of the province, which opens up a lot different avenues and funding sources for that to happen. It would be a Ministry of Infrastructure or a Ministry of Transportation decision. So I think that is the next question, is where that should be located. I've heard proposals because Lethbridge continues to grow, jumping it down south outside of the airport. There's another option there. And then there's different avenues for funding, including the possibility of a toll, which would jump it up the time frame. I know that's not necessarily very popular, but user fee can help that. And it can help bring a project forward instead of waiting for 10 or 15 years, bring it up to a 5 or 7 year kind of time frame.
Now let's talk about affordable housing here for just a moment. The province has a 10-year strategy that will apparently improve and expand affordable housing. Stronger foundations will help provide safe, stable, and affordable housing for an additional 25,000 households. How does Stronger Foundation strategy actually work?
Well, this is the bringing the power of private enterprise into this market, where it's no longer just the government trying to fund it, and then you're in the waiting list for your next project. This allows private enterprise to develop, build, and bring them on, and yet the government still pays for the supported housing component of that. And that way you can get a lot more doors available to people much more quickly. And I think that's the real key there. A lot of proponents are supportive of this private partnership, and that's what we really want to see. I think it's pretty straightforward supply and demand. The more houses you have available, the lower that cost is to those individuals. And that's the partnership that we're looking for.
Now, the Alberta NDP allegedly broke fundraising records in their fiscal third quarter, raising $1.3 million in donations from over 32,000 individual donors. The UCP, meanwhile, fundraised about $1.24 million. That's according to Elections Alberta. Nathan, what will it really take to win back support for your party and get more grassroots Albertans to support you and your party?
Yeah, Hal, that's another good question. We have to get past COVID, to be perfectly honest. We all know how much COVID has impacted our lives. Economically, it's really hit small businesses very, very hard. It's impacted everybody, both public and private. But that job security, that ability to donate, and even that desire to look outside of your personal circumstances has really diminished. So if we can get past COVID, then we can start to see the improvement in our economy. I think we have lots of really great projects coming online. We're actually hearing more and more about people needing more people to come to work, not less. So we're seeing that economic turn. And then if we can get back to opening our economy locally as well as globally and see that recovery, then the third step is that social recovery, where people become more used to going out, more used to being able to look out for others, and therefore bring their donations back. But it's going to take a process, and it's going to take some time.
Lethbridge East MLA Nathan Neudorf, thanks so much for joining us today from Edmonton.
Thanks, Hal. Appreciate it.